had had a fight scene in the very first scene in a picture I did with Clint Eastwood. That's when you find out who your friends are.
He was the undisputed king of the box office, the mustache, the playful grin, that lazy, dangerous charm. For an entire generation, Burt Reynolds didn't just appear in movies. He defined what a leading man was supposed to be. But behind the jokes on talk shows, behind the roaring car chases, and the flirtatious smile, there was a name that lingered in the background of his mind like a shadow he could never quite escape: Clint Walker. To young actors in the 1950s, Clint Walker wasn't just another colleague. He was a mountain in human form. 6'6", broad-shouldered, with a jaw built for Western close-ups and a presence that filled a screen before he even spoke. While Burt scraped by on bit parts and short guest roles, Clint was already a towering television star, the unshakable hero of Cheyenne. Fans argued for decades in smoky bars and crowded living rooms. Who would win in a real fight, Burt Reynolds or Clint Walker? One was the wisecracking rebel, always ready with a punchline and a right hook. The other was the silent giant, a man who barely needed words to own a room. Most people thought it was a fun fantasy matchup, but for Burt, it was something else, because the story between them was never truly about who would win. It was about envy, about pride, about the quiet respect a man feels for someone he can't quite outshine. Late in his life, long after the glory days of the Smokey and the Bandit, long after the money troubles, the broken relationships, and the health scares, Burt Reynolds finally sat down for a rare, reflective interview. This time, the cocky ladies' man act faded. The mask slipped. He spoke Clint Walker's name. Then, almost reluctantly, he admitted something he hadn't said out loud before. "I'll tell you the truth," Burt said softly. "I envied him a bit." That single confession opened the door to a story most people never heard. A story about two very different men who shared the same brutal business, the same dreams, and the same unforgiving town. To understand why Burt Reynolds felt that way, why a man who once ruled Hollywood still measured himself against Clint Walker, we have to go back before the mustache, back before the Trans Am and the big paychecks, back to a young athlete whose entire future was destroyed in one violent collision, and to the twist of fate that turned a shattered football dream into the beginning of a Hollywood legend. Before the mustache, before the movie posters, and the late-night talk shows, Burt Reynolds was just a boy from the South with one simple dream: to play football and make his father proud. He grew up in a strict household. His father, a tough World War II veteran and later a police chief, believed in discipline more than tenderness. Burt was wild, restless, always getting into trouble, always testing limits. But on the football field, all that energy finally had a purpose. Under the Friday night lights, he wasn't the kid who got into fights or mouthed off to teachers. He was fast, explosive, the kind of player who could change the whole mood of a game with one run. Football gave him something he had never truly felt before: identity. It told him who he was. It told him he mattered. Coaches noticed, scouts noticed. Soon, the boy from a small town in Florida earned a scholarship to play college football. For a kid like Burt, it felt like a golden ticket out of ordinary life. This was supposed to be the path: play college ball, maybe turn pro, become the kind of man even his hard, distant father would have to respect. And then, in one violent instant, it was gone. A brutal collision on the field shattered more than his body. He tore up his knee and injured his ribs and shoulder. The pain was bad, but the fear was worse. The doctors talked about recovery, rehab, time, but coaches stopped looking at him the same way. The player they once saw as a weapon suddenly became a risk. When he tried to come back, he wasn't as fast. He didn't cut the same. That extra spark that had set him apart just wasn't there. Eventually, the scholarship disappeared. So did the future he had built in his head. He was young, injured, broke, and angry, angrier than he'd ever been in his life. Football had been his entire identity, and it had been ripped away before he even got a real chance. For a while, Burt drifted. He took odd jobs, tried to figure out what a boy who no longer had football was supposed to become. The world suddenly felt enormous and empty, and he had no map anymore. Then, by what felt like pure accident, someone suggested he try out for a play. At first, it sounded like a joke. Burt Reynolds, the ex-jock, on a stage? But he stepped into that small theater, rehearsed his lines under hot lights, and something unexpected happened. He heard people laugh at his timing. He felt the air change when he walked on stage. He felt that same rush he once felt running down a football field. But this time, it came from words, from expression, from presence. An English teacher saw it in him, a spark, a natural charisma, a way of capturing attention that couldn't be taught. You might have lost football, the teacher told him, but you haven't lost your gift. You just haven't discovered what it really is yet. Slowly, painfully, Burt began to let go of the dream of being a football hero and started chasing a new one, acting. But as he took his first tiny steps into show business, he looked up at the screens and saw men who already seemed to own the world he was trying to enter. One of those men was Clint Walker, while Burt was just learning how to hit his marks and not trip over his own feet on camera. Clint was already larger than life, the rock-solid star of a hit Western series, a man whose physical presence alone could carry an entire episode. Burt, the ex-athlete with the broken knee, looked at this towering figure on television and felt something complicated twist inside him. Admiration, resentment, and a gnawing question. If I hadn't gotten hurt, could I have been that strong? That unshakable? That question would follow him for years, even as he began to climb. The moment that changed Burt Reynolds' life didn't happen on a football field. It happened on a stage. After his injury, after the scholarship was gone, and the future he'd built in his mind had vanished, he drifted through junior college, angry and lost. He bounced from class to class, job to job, carrying a heavy sense of failure on his shoulders. Then one teacher did something that seemed small at the time but quietly altered everything. They pushed him toward acting. Try out for the play, they suggested. Burt resisted, then gave in. Under the harsh stage lights, in front of a small audience, he discovered something no doctor could measure and no coach could diagram. His voice, his posture, the way he could make people laugh or fall silent with a single line, it was all there, waiting. He didn't have a football uniform anymore, but he still had presence. That presence, the raw charm, the natural swagger, the hint of a cowboy in his walk, made him a perfect fit for westerns. Hollywood noticed just enough to give him a shot, but not enough to hand him a stardom. He found himself playing bit parts, a deputy here, a gunslinger there, background roles in dusty frontier towns, where he was hired more for his looks and physicality than for any belief in his talent. Hollywood saw him as a handsome newcomer, someone who looked good on a horse, someone who could take a punch and stay in frame. Those small roles didn't make headlines. There were no magazine covers, no screaming crowds, but brick by brick, they became the foundation of his career. And then, in the early 1970s, everything changed. Burt Reynolds landed a role in a film that no one expected would transform him from working actor to cinematic force. Deliverance. It was raw, unforgiving, unpolished. There were no easy jokes to hide behind, no safe, smiling charm to lean on. For the first time, audiences saw him stripped down to something deeper. A man pushed to his limits, scared, vulnerable, and furious all at once. Deliverance didn't just succeed, it exploded. Critics raved, audiences packed theaters, and suddenly Burt Reynolds wasn't just a familiar face, he was the face. From that point on, he embodied a very particular American fantasy, the rebellious, confident, good-hearted rogue who always seemed to be in on the joke. In car chases, prison comedies, and action-packed romps, he moved like someone who knew the world might beat him up, but would never break him. Yet there was always more to him than the wisecracks and the grin. Even when he leaned into comedy and action, he carried emotional weight that lingered long after the credits rolled. You could see it in the way his eyes darkened in quiet moments, the way his smile sometimes seemed to cover something heavier underneath. Years later, long after the first wave of his stardom, he would deliver one of the finest performances of his career in Boogie Nights as Jack Horner, a complicated, aging adult film director trapped between pride and regret. That role would earn him an Academy Award nomination and remind the world that under the mustache and mischief, there was a serious actor with real depth. But success, especially in Hollywood, is a double-edged sword. Behind the fame, behind the swagger, Burt Reynolds was already walking into some of the darkest valleys of his life. Valleys filled with financial missteps, failed projects, and personal heartbreaks that would test every ounce of resilience he had built since the day football was taken from him. And all the while, somewhere out there, Clint Walker stood as a quiet counterpoint, the giant cowboy who never seemed to chase the spotlight as hard, yet always carried a kind of calm strength Burt could not ignore. At the height of his fame, it looked like Burt Reynolds had everything a man could want. He was the #1 box office star in America. His face was on magazine covers, his movies filled theaters, and his charm made talk shows feel like his living room. But the higher he climbed, the more fragile the ground beneath him became. Burt's love life was as dramatic as any film he ever made. He fell hard, loved intensely, and often chose women who came with their own storms. One of the most important relationships of his life was with actress Sally Field. She wasn't just a co-star. She was the woman he later called the love of my life. With her, he felt something he rarely experienced in Hollywood: safety. But fame, pride, and his own emotional scars got in the way. There were arguments, insecurities, and pressures from a career that demanded more and more of his time and attention. Eventually, that love slipped away, not with a dramatic explosion, but with the slow, painful realization that they couldn't keep going the way they were. Years later, Burt would look back and admit that losing Sally Field was one of his greatest regrets. He had been the charming rogue on the screen, but in private, he didn't always know how to hold on to the people who truly mattered. Then came his high-profile marriage to actress Lonnie Anderson. From the outside, it looked like a perfect Hollywood pairing, the handsome movie star and the glamorous blonde TV icon. The tabloids devoured every photo, every appearance, every hint of drama. Behind closed doors, the relationship was far from perfect. There were rumors of overspending, jealousy, and emotional distance. The marriage that had been sold to the public as a fairy tale slowly twisted into a bitter battleground. When it finally ended, it didn't just break his heart, it shattered his bank account. Burt Reynolds was forced to confront the one thing he had never imagined facing: financial ruin, bad investments, failed business ventures, divorce costs, and tax problems all piled up. The man who had once been Hollywood's golden boy found himself filing for bankruptcy. He sold homes, auctioned off memorabilia, watched pieces of his past disappear just to keep going. And the hits didn't stop there. Years of performing his own stunts and pushing his body to the limit caught up with him. He battled chronic pain, endured surgeries, and at one point became dependent on pain medication. The once invincible action star now moved more slowly, cautiously, each step a reminder of the price he had paid for his career. Hollywood, as it always does, moved on. Younger faces appeared on the posters, new names filled the headlines. The phone didn't ring as often. Roles that once seemed written just for him now went to other actors. In interviews, he tried to keep the old charm alive, the jokes, the smile, the playful arrogance. But there were moments, brief and unguarded, when the sadness in his eyes betrayed him. He had flown higher than most people ever dream of, and he had fallen hard. In those quiet years, as he looked back over his life, the fame, the money, the failures, and the broken relationships, the image of Clint Walker took on a different meaning. Clint had never chased the spotlight the same way. He wasn't in the tabloids every week. He didn't lean on scandal to stay irrelevant. Instead, he carried himself with a calm, almost old-fashioned dignity. He had faced his own battles, his own brushes with death and hardship, but he never seemed as consumed by the chaos of fame as Burt had been. For a man like Burt Reynolds, who had lived so loudly, that kind of a steady strength was both admirable and quietly painful to compare himself to. The world knew Burt as the wild, laughing star with the fast cars and faster comebacks. But in his later years, when the cameras were gone and the lights were dim, he finally began to speak honestly about the one man he had once seen as a rival, and eventually came to acknowledge, with something very close to awe, in his later years, Burt Reynolds spent a lot more time in chairs than in fast cars, not the director's chair, not the driver's seat of a Trans Am, just a simple chair under the soft lights of interview studios, talking about a life that felt like several lifetimes packed into one. The swagger was still there in flashes. The jokes were still sharp, but there was also a tired honesty now, the kind of truth that only seems to come once a man has lost enough things he thought he could never live without. When Clint Walker's name came up, the mood always shifted. To shallow ears, the story was simple. Clint was the kind of man Burt could never be. Towering, calm, carved out of a stone, with a quiet dignity that seemed to come as naturally to him as that cocky grin came to Burt. Hollywood had loved to compare them. Fans, too. They'd talk about it like some fantasy matchup. Burt Reynolds versus Clint Walker. Who's tougher? Who wins the fight? For a long time, Burt played along with the joke. He'd roll his eyes, make a wisecrack, pretend the whole thing didn't bother him at all. But when the cameras got a little closer and the years had softened his defenses, the truth slipped through. He admitted that seeing Clint on the screen, especially in those early days, had stung. While Burt was still hustling for tiny roles, Clint was already Cheyenne Buddy, the strong, silent Western hero every young boy wanted to be. Clint didn't need to crack jokes or flex his charm. He simply walked into frame and you believed he could handle anything. Burt, the ex-football player with the shattered knee, watched a man who looked like he'd been born bulletproof. And that's where the hate came in. Not the kind of hate that wants to destroy someone, the kind that burns quietly inside when you see in another man everything you once hoped to be. He hated Clint Walker the way a wounded athlete hates the game he can no longer play. He hated him because Clint was a living reminder of the path that had been stolen from him, the path of physical dominance, of simple, unshakable strength. But under that burn of jealousy, something else was growing. Respect. Burt watched Clint survive not just Hollywood, but life itself. He saw how Clint handled career ups and downs, personal struggles, and even a terrible accident that nearly killed him, and still came back with the same steady, grounded presence. There were no messy tabloid blow-ups, no loud public breakdowns, no desperate clinging to the spotlight. Where Burt's life looked like a roller coaster, soaring triumphs, brutal crashes, very public scars, Clint's life looked more like a long, hard trail crossed by a man who never forgot who he was. In one of his more candid moments, Burt broke through the old persona and let the truth out. He admitted that he had been jealous. He acknowledged that, for years, Clint represented a kind of strength he himself had never truly possessed, at least not in the same way. Maybe he didn't use grand poetry or long emotional speeches. That wasn't Burt's style, but you could hear it in his voice when he spoke about Clint Walker. The grudging smile, the little shake of the head, the tone of a man who knows he's finally being honest about an old wound. For decades, the world thought the story was Burt Reynolds versus Clint Walker. But in the end, it wasn't a boxing match. It was a mirror. Burt didn't truly hate Clint Walker. He hated what Clint represented. The life he might have had, the simplicity he never knew, the inner peace that seemed to have slipped through his own fingers. And in that quiet recognition, there was something almost beautiful, because buried inside his jealousy was an unmistakable confession. He admired Clint Walker deeply. In the end, both men walked very different roads. Clint Walker was never the loudest man in the room. He didn't chase every spotlight, didn't live for scandal, didn't treat fame like an addiction he needed to feed. He came from a hard, working-class background, fought for his place, nearly died in a freak accident, and yet moved through life with the same quiet, steady strength that made him unforgettable on a screen. He wasn't the type to brag. He didn't have to. His presence did the talking for him. Burt Reynolds, on the other hand, lived like a man who knew his time at the top might be brief and tried to squeeze every last drop out of it. He joked loudly, loved fiercely, spent recklessly. He soared higher than almost any star of his era, and when he fell in full view of the world. He made bad choices. He hurt people who loved him. He lost fortunes, trust, and precious years to pride and pain. And yet, there was always something deeply human about him. He wasn't a polished legend carved in stone. He was flawed, emotional, sometimes foolish, sometimes heroic. You could see the little boy who lost his dream of football. You could see the middle-aged man trying to hold on to his kingdom, and you could see the older man humbled at last, looking back and finally telling the truth. That's what makes his confession about Clint Walker so powerful. Because when a man like Burt Reynolds, proud, charismatic, stubborn, finally admits, "I envied him a bit," he isn't just talking about another actor. He's talking about himself, about the parts of his soul that never felt solid, about the strength he admired because he never truly felt it inside his own chest. Clint Walker represented the kind of man who didn't need to run from his past or from himself. Burt Reynolds represented the man who has spent a lifetime running, laughing, deflecting, charming, until there was nowhere left to run. And here is the quiet truth at the center of their story. Sometimes the people we hate the most are the ones who expose what we fear we're missing. Sometimes jealousy is just admiration that hasn't learned how to speak honestly yet. Burt's journey from broken football star to Hollywood royalty to a man sitting in a chair reflecting on a life of spectacular wins and painful losses is more than a celebrity story. It's a mirror for anyone who has ever compared themselves to someone else and come up short. Maybe you've known a Clint Walker in your own life, the person who always seems stronger, calmer, more stable than you, the one whose life looks simpler, whose path looks clearer, whose mistakes never seem as loud as yours. And maybe, like Burt, you felt that sharp sting of envy. But here's the lesson buried inside his final honesty. Jealousy can destroy you, or it can teach you. It can drag you down into bitterness, make you cruel, make you small. Or if you're brave enough to face it, it can show you what you truly value, strength, dignity, peace, and push you to grow toward it in your own way. Burt Reynolds never became Clint Walker. He was never meant to. Instead, he became something entirely different, a symbol of flawed, reckless, captivating humanity. A reminder that even the biggest stars can break, and that sometimes the real courage isn't in pretending you're invincible, but in admitting that you're not. In the end, two men stood side by side in Hollywood history. Clint Walker, the mountain who never tried to be anything but himself. Burt Reynolds, the storm who finally at last learned to tell the truth about his own heart. And maybe that's the message their story that leaves us with. Don't let envy turn you into a stranger to yourself. Learn from the people you admire. Respect the strength you see in others, but never forget that your own path, with all its scars and detours, has a value no one else can replicate. Because when the lights go down and the credits roll and the crowd goes home, the only person you truly have to live with is the one you see in the mirror.